So we're going to have 6 more sessions, and as we said, the idea would be to focus on particular topics with respect to Buber's philosophy of communication, and we had been talking a little bit about earlier on about Buber and we're interested in maybe a session on Buber and Landauer, and maybe Buber and Heidegger, maybe some other topics. Other people have also come forward with some of their ideas. So towards the end, I'll just put up a little list of all the themes that have circulated so far, and then maybe you can have a think about that. And for next term, for next time, maybe before we break for the holidays, we can then sort of decide on a list of topics. My idea would be that we would take one topic for each session of the 6 sessions that we have. And Jordan wrote to me with an idea which I really liked, to offer the option, the possibility for people to meet outside of the sessions that we have together in smaller working groups to work on a particular topic. And I thought maybe it would be a good idea to combine that with this idea of topic-based sessions in the second semester, so that these little groups, if they form, that they could prepare or take sort of charge of leading us through this particular topic that they are working on in one of the sessions. Jordan, is that an accurate representation of what you proposed?
Yes, that's very nice. Thank you.
Yeah. And so if everybody thinks that that is a good idea, then we can keep that in mind as well for next time. And once we have our list of topics, then we can look into that. So I have actually, I'll show it to you now. We were just talking, Vic and I already forgot 2 of the 4 topics that we had come up with ourselves. But people have so far proposed something on Buber and Landauer, so that was actually Vic and me. Buber and Heidegger, we also want that to look into that for the next session, so the last one this semester. Then Anastasia proposed language and symbolic power, feminist dialogues with Buber, which I think is a very, very important topic, which we'll also see today when we're looking at the Erziehung, Charaktererziehung, the education of character, which the language is atrocious of the text and badly needs updating. Art, architecture, aesthetics was mentioned, dialogue and psychoanalysis. What does it mean to be wholly alive? And I think there was Jordan actually, and also linked this to the idea of living for a cause. Buber has this idea of destiny, of becoming free when you relate to destiny, and we could look into what that means. Phenomenology of intersubjectivity. Patricia, who can't be here today, has said that she would like to lead a group on that. And then Marcus, I'm going to ask you later on to introduce your topic in a bit more detail. I proposed maybe a working group on Buber's Hebrew humanism and on reconciliation through dialogue. So this is already more than 6. And there are 2 that I'm missing and that I just forgot. Vic, do you remember what we said?
I think we were thinking one of them was in terms of Buber's Hasidic work.
Ah, yes, exactly.
That could be included with Hebrew humanism in some way or combined.
Yeah.
Possibility, but that was one of the areas, I think.
And there was another one, but I forgot now what it was.
Yeah, that will come back. Levinas was the other one.
Oh yes. Buber and Levinas. Yeah.
Because there's a whole text on the dialogue with Levinas.
Yeah.
And there's some very materials on that.
We might even think of combining that with this one here.
Yeah.
Yeah. These are some ideas that we so we'll return to this topic, but this is about next term, and I very much like this because it goes back to my old student days when it was the norm that all the participants in a seminar would work together on what they were going to do in the seminar, and that's far cry from how it goes these days. So
it also a way of organizing in a more dialogical way. So it's trying to, how do you make a seminar a practice of dialogue by including everybody, but also framing a sense of equal voice, that all of us in some way have equal voice within it.
Precisely. That is exactly it. It's a democratic way of studying or of working on a topic. Thank you for that. So I'm trying to, yeah, okay. So we will get back to that, and there is already discussion going on in the dialogue, in the chat box on. Peter says we're particularly interested. This might fit with a couple of the list of possibilities in thinking about possible implications of Buber's philosophy of dialogue for democratic politics. So this is this contemporary theme that we touched upon last time as well. In a world that is defined by media bubbles and people living in their own mediated echo chambers, what can dialogue do to help unmoor the drift or the dead end that the public sphere seems to have gotten into these days. So that's another theme that I think is coming up. Now, for today, so we had two texts, the education of character, which you want to be the main focus of the discussion, and then in the background, sort of reverberating with it, is the first part of I and Tao. We'll see how far we get with these texts. Just to make a little bridge from the last time when we had Paul's contribution on the phenomenology of trust. We're not going to summarize that whole thing, but just maybe a few remarks from my perspective on what I reflected on after that session and how it links to the question of the education of character. Just to sort of highlight that. So we had this idea of a phenomenology of trust, of a phenomenological exploration of trust as the basis of dialogue. And I think one of the ideas that we can take from that is that trust functions, according to what Paul was saying, functions as the ground of dialogue. I think that was a phrase that was used. And what that in Buber, and what that seems, and that's why a phenomenological analysis of it could help us to understand how something important about what dialogue is. And I think, well, in what it became in my mind was that if we think about what phenomenology in this context means, Paul said, well, phenomenology for Buber means encounter. And with that, if we look at it in a sort of through the light of systematic philosophy, Buber breaks open a little bit the format of phenomenology as it is traditionally conceived, where the world or the intersubjective relation is a constitution by the subject. Whereas, well, there is a lot to be said about that, as we will discover when we look into that topic in more detail. But there is, on the one hand, in all of Buber's writings, clear affinity with phenomenology and the careful description of the makeup of our world of experience. But on the other hand, there's also always this critical attitude towards phenomenology as a project that very quickly becomes quite idealist in its connotations. Sees the world and experience as I said, an achievement or a constitution by a subject rather than an encounter with between realities. So the sphere of the between, whether that can be adequately dealt with in a phenomenology, strictly speaking, that is one of the questions that we got from the talk last week. Paul, I see you are back now. I'm just sort of bridging from last week to this week. And then with respect to trust, we thought that trust is in a way the ground of this between, as Emily says in the chat, who was closer to ontology than phenomenology. Well, this between is an ontological notion, and we might think of trust in two ways. I think that's something that also came out of the talk last time. Yeah, Emily, I'll get into that in a minute. There is a kind of trust, which is the trust that somebody will do something, that yeah, everybody will pay their taxes on time, or that you won't wait, or you won't cheat on me, or all these sorts of things. And that's kind of trusting that somebody will do something. That is a kind of trust that you might say is earned. And as a Dutch expression is, this kind of trust comes on foot and leaves on horseback. So this is the kind of trust that can be broken, or that can also be disappointed and then has to be rebuilt. And that can be a very difficult thing, sometimes impossible, sometimes possible. But it is a kind of trust that people will do something, or that a certain kind of future might be there. There is another form of trust, which I think Paul highlighted, and that we might think about that as a trust in a person. So there is a kind of unconditional trust that we can feel with respect to people. Sometimes we feel it only with respect to some people and not to others, which is hard to conceptualize, and we saw that in the talk last week. Hard to express, but it is a kind of not giving up on people, and not out of the goodness of your heart. So it is not an ethical or a moral achievement to do that. It comes more out of the recognition that without that trust, this space of dialogue just cannot be there. There has to be a kind of, I think the only word for it, maybe Paul used that even, is unconditional trust. And we can't really say it's a trust that will happen, but it is a trust no matter what in a person. And once we get to that level, that's what I took from the talk in terms of phenomenology of trust. We see that it is ontological, to get back to Emily's question in the chat. We see that this kind of trust makes possible the encounter between people. If that kind of trust wouldn't be there as a kind of ultimate horizon of our relation to others, dialogue would not make sense. You could probably even push the point and say the idea of speech would not be possible. And if you extend that idea into systematic philosophy, you might say Habermas's idea of an ideal speech situation, which some of you may be familiar with, is a kind of secularized version of this. There's always the horizon of opening up to the conversation again, and that seems to be, for me, that's one of the main takeaways that seems to be at work in this notion of trust. Buber draws it quickly into a religious context, but even if you don't share that background, then you can easily, I think, understand this point that God also, let's say, trusts us unconditionally. Not because he doesn't know any better, he knows perfectly well what we are capable of, but nevertheless, there is this trust that doesn't go away between, let's say, Yahweh and Israel, and also between the divine and the human in a more generalized sense. And it can also be there between people. It's the ground of dialogue. That's what we saw. And I think that was very, very helpful in getting to understand what is really going on in dialogue, that without this kind of openness towards the other, which is ultimately an openness towards the future, that there will be a future, we cannot make sense of the idea of human relationship in the sense of the between. So that leads us to the question, well, what can we do with this trust? Can it be cultivated? It is a matter of, as I said, I think for Buber, it is not some sort of, God doesn't trust us unconditionally out of the goodness of his heart, and we don't trust others unconditionally out of the goodness of our hearts. It is a kind of, this word has come up several times already, it's a kind of grace. There's something out of our control that befalls us, or that is bestowed upon us. A kind of openness to which we can choose to be receptive or not, without which, again, this dialogue cannot take place. But what can we do with it? How can it become part of a life? How can it become part of an ethic, or of a form of life, a way of life? Can it be? What do we do? What do we do with it? It seems to me that is maybe a way into what led Buber in 1939 to write this essay on the education of character, which was an address that he gave to what was then called the Palestinian, the Teachers Association of the Palestinian region, or something like that. I'll look at it in a minute. In 1939, he gave this talk in Tel Aviv. Vic will say a few words about it, and then we'll go into a discussion on the basis of the text. But before we do that, I would like to ask Paul, if you are willing, Paul, to maybe share with us a little bit of what the the discussion that we had and the seminar that we had in the 2 weeks after it, what it has done in your own thinking. Would that be okay?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I would define trust as existential trust. But I like to, in a response to an exchange Johan and I had regarding an essay that Habermas wrote regarding Buber, you noted that he, if I understood your letter correctly, that he somehow didn't really attune himself to what Buber had to say. I have often had that experience. I had a dialogue with an Israeli diplomat, and he said, "Oh, I've had dialogues with the Palestinians and Egyptians." Of course, dialogue is not a question of negotiation. And I've also had an exchange with a great, well, I can mention her name, Martha Nussbaum, an ethicist, as she calls herself, who's steeped in her training as a classicist. And she said, well, compared Buber to the dialogues of, of the Greek classics. Again, it's not what Buber has in mind. A dialogue, as Buber currently suggested, is to be understood through a Taoist concept of Wu Wei, which means you're both passive and yet at the same time paradoxically active. And I'd like to just expand on that briefly. A dialogue has, I think, multiple dimensions. One is with oneself, to prepare oneself, the attitude. And then the attitude allows you to respond to an individual or a situation which calls upon you. And therefore, Buber says dialogue is both a question of being prepared and grace. And just reflecting on myself and trust, I constantly have to trust my own self. Despite everything, as my smile and tone of my voice, I can be wicked. I can be self-absorbed. And that requires a great deal of attention to oneself, ultimately to gain trust to one's own relationship to the world. And that requires, of course, us to be humble, to be self-critical. In Hebrew, we have an expression called cheshbon nefesh, constantly scrutinizing one's soul. As a parent, as a teacher, as a friend, I'm constantly aware of that. I'm not certain I'm really trusting myself or others. Buber has another example, I think, that is probably true and at least captures it. He said, at the same time, we should be homo politicus, making decisions to enter the world, but at the same time, homo problematicus, attentive to the problematics of the world and ourselves. So it's not clearly, as Johan said, it's not an ethical issue. It's existential and psychological. I'm going to suggest several friends here in Jerusalem, actually a group of 35 health workers, psychiatrists, psychoanalysts who work on Buber, and as a mode of restoring trust in oneself and the trust of the other. I can understand that the psychoanalyst obviously wishes to help. I don't think they use the word patient any longer, but I'll use it since I don't know the proper. I can say it in Hebrew, but I don't know how to say it in English. Anyway, the patient, to trust in oneself, to gain trust in the ability to live, and to we can elaborate that. But clearly, this suggests that trust dialogue is as twofolds. One, that cultivating our attitude, which is not simply an ethical exercise. One of Buber's close friends was Erich Fromm, who worked with Buber and Rosenzweig in Frankfurt, wrote a marvelous book on the art of loving. You have to learn to love yourself in order to love the other. And that's not easy. Learning to trust oneself, an ability to be able to trust others. And therefore, dialogue is not to be understood as one does in California. I attended one of those sessions. I love you, you love me, and you embrace each other over tea and smile. And it's not, it's a lifelong project. And to be honest, I guess we all are. As a parent, I'm a parent of 2 children, 4 grandchildren, and of course a wife. As I mentioned last time, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary, and it's a journey with many bumps in the road. So dialogue is certainly not an easy process. It's a life. In that sense, it's grounded in the very notion of being. Towards the end of his life, Buber was asked, "Can you summarize your teaching?" He said, "That's very difficult, but I can only say that what I've done all these years, at least I think I've done, is I took my partner in conversation, not dialogue yet, in conversation, to an open window, and pointed out the window to what is obvious, that we all are alone ultimately." The essay between man and man, Buber talks about being lost in the cosmos. We're homeless, and we have to recognize the fact that we are all, in some fundamental sense, homeless. How do we create a sense of home? And there's a lot of work you can do on the notion of home and what it means to be at home, to feel at home, to feel that you belong, that you're accepted, that you're simply loved. And that is a daily process. And Buber refers to the Hebrew expression, I'll say in Hebrew, "Bria mitchadeshet kol yom." Creation is renewed every day and every hour. And relationships have to be renewed, and our sense of self has to be renewed. So just simply saying dialogue is it's not a simple formula. It is for Buber, it's the challenge of life. What I wanted to add to what I said when Buber pointed out the window, he says, "Well, if you want a formulation, I'll give you one, but please don't accept it as a philosophical decree. But if you want a formulation, it is what he called in German the Ontologie des Zwischenmenschlichen, the ontology of the in-between." We can come back to that, but it's life is between one human being and the other. It's philosophers call it subjectivity, but these are terms which can obscure or offuscate as I think you said very well in your letter to me, Johan. It's a way of life.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, and we made that point earlier. I said it in quite coarse language that if you try to explain the I-thou relationship by saying, "Oh, it's between 2 subjects," then it's the world upside down. We can only make sense of this talk of subjects on the basis of primordial experience of the I-thou relationship. So you're trying to explain something by reference to something more abstract. And actually you're just banking on your own understanding of it that you already have, but you don't make anything. I think it's a fundamental problem in many approaches to philosophy. Whitehead was very clear about it, actually how that worked. But thanks very much, Paul, for this reflection. That helps us. So Vic, can I ask you to say a few words around the education of character, and then we go into this?
I just want to say something in response to Paul, which I thought really, really helpful remarks. One is about how we think about the ethical and whether there's the opposition between the ethical as somehow relating to others and the existential as relating to ourselves. And I would have thought that we could have a more expanded vision of the ethical, partly created and formed through reading Buber, in which we can both acknowledge the importance of our relationship to ourselves in being able to establish a relationship or a dialogue with others. So I completely agree of the importance, almost as a lifelong task, of how is it that we, and here I'm introducing a different term, how is it that we get access to ourselves in a way that can allow us to be open to others? And ways often that even if we want to be open to others, we can find it difficult. So it's not just a question of will, and nor is it a question of desire, but it is a question of almost a lifelong task of working on and in oneself in a way to be open to others. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking that trust becomes important also through the Hebrew, the link between truth and truthfulness, and how to be truthful in our relationship to other. The link in Hebrew between emet and emunah, between the notion of truth and the notion of trust. And there's an internal connection between what does it mean to be truthful both with ourselves in ways that allow us to be open in our relationship with others, in a way that I want to cross the boundary Paul suggested between ethics as somehow related to our relationships with others and the importance of working on ourselves. And I do think in my own life lesson, how hard it was for me, even in my most intimate relationship, to be able to trust that even my partner, Anna, could really be there for me. Because my masculinity had been shaped around an idea of being independent and self-sufficient. Mm-hmm. And within European societies, the notion of masculinity is often framed in that way, that we're somehow self-sufficient. So that even if we want to be open to others, and we might even want to be desperately open to others, we can't necessarily do that because we don't have the access to ourselves which allows us to be open to others. So there's a way that the notion of trust and trusting ourselves isn't something under the control of our wills, isn't something just that we can desire. It involves taking certain kinds of risks. And often it's only in appreciating or learning how to appreciate others, even saying what it is in our day-to-day. When Paul says that, creation is something which is, in the Hebrew, we create ourselves every day, and also we create our relationships, both our intimate and our more social relationships are recreated every day. And we have to trust that someone can be there for us. And often I've done a lot of work on masculinity because I realized how tied I was, tied up, entangled almost, with a masculinity that was taken to be human in a way that Buber doesn't necessarily open up to. But it means that it's a struggle to trust that someone else can really be there for us. There's there's really interesting work by a kind of Danish theologian, philosopher, called Løstrup. There are lots of really interesting echoes with Buber. And Løstrup, in a fundamental way, says trust is the ground of our being and our relationship with others, and that the trust is somehow part of what it means to be human or an ethical human. It isn't that people have to do things in order to gain our trust, but that somehow to be in relationship is already to be in a relationship of trust. So it's very deeply set. And that Løstrup work is a critique, like Buber's, of a tradition of kind of liberal individualism. It says that in trusting others and learning how to trust ourselves, that we can actually be moral beings. And I think there are sources in Buber's Hebrew humanism which critique a kind of long-term Kantian tradition that says, no, we're individuals, And it's only gradually that we can learn to trust others because of what they have done. And there's a vision then of how painful it can be in our relationships when that trust is broken. But we can't simply repair it easily, but we need to have a moral theory, and I call it a moral theory, which can allow us to understand the process through which we might be able to rebuild that trust, or the risks we might have to take without knowing that there is even the possibility of rebuilding that trust. So in notions where there's been other relationships or words broken, the notion of trust means that when that trust is broken, there's something in the truthfulness, linking back to the notion of emet and emunah in the Hebrew, there's something deeply broken. And we need a conception of the human ethical subject which allows us to understand the depths to which we can be closed or hurt. And I think our traditions, and I think it's the strength of a lot of Hebrew traditions, to find a language in which the different levels at which that trust can be broken can be voiced, articulated, often in learning both to listen to ourselves and the way that we have betrayed trust, and then the risks we can take in order to be able to be open. And in this text, which I thought was really exciting, the Buber text on education, just moving slightly forward to that as Johan suggested, there's a way that Buber talks about the whole person and the narrative of educating character as educating the whole person. He doesn't necessarily give us a sense of how to think about that whole person, but he implies a certain contrast between character and personality. And that somehow in character, or in our role as teachers, and I've been a teacher for many years, I've got to be prepared to take risks. I can't expect students to take risks and show themselves in particular ways unless I'm prepared to take a risk. And there's a kind of awareness of the risk-taking which is involved in being truthful. And in our contemporary notions of education, where education is reduced to the delivery of certain objectives, the teacher often never learns how to be open to their students because their effectiveness is judged in the learning outcomes that each lesson is supposed to have. So there's a way that Buber is very contemporary in his critique of certainly the British, and I don't know what the American educational systems over the last 15, 20 years. And he's opening up deep questions that the culture, certainly a neoliberal culture, has wanted to close down, about the difficulties of education and the difficulties of dialogue or genuine dialogue established between teachers and students. Unless we have a dialogue with ourselves, as Paul says, unless we do that work on ourselves, we can't hope to ever engage with meaningful dialogue with others, either as parents or as teachers.
Thanks, Vic, for that wonderful introduction to the text and linking it to the work, to the question of trusting yourself. And I think there are a few moments in the paper where Buber addresses precisely this point. So I hope that we can look a little bit closer at that. I think this factor of risk, I just want to echo what you were saying, is very important, and it also links this theme very nicely to Bloch's philosophy, which of course we're not talking about, but it's always in the background of the Bloch Center. This idea that what Bloch calls the principle of hope, das Prinzip Hoffnung, points precisely to this. We are alive in the moment where we take a risk, where something might actually go wrong. If there is not that possibility, then we are not at the front of life, as he calls it. We're not at the edge where things happen and where we might make an encounter. And he even goes so far as to say, can hope be disappointed? Yes, it can, and how, and it must, because if it wasn't disappointed, it wouldn't be hope. It would be a guarantee. And so this sort of hoping against hope, or the risk factor in the moment of truth. But sometimes you can also think of it in terms of a necessarily partisan character of truth. There is something at stake. I think that to link that to trust helps us, I think, in a very, very deep way to understand something about dialogue.
And that's really helpful to have the link between Buber and Bloch in that way.
Yeah.
I think the risk-taking, what Paul said about dialogue is not negotiation. Precisely. Negotiation is often, I won't make a move unless my partner makes a move first. I'm not going to risk or show myself to be vulnerable unless I know I'm going to be well received.
Precisely.
So risk-taking character, or how we evaluate or how we think the place of risk in human relationships and who's prepared to take it, I think is a really deep and difficult issue. And often in negotiation, the difference between dialogue and negotiation is that in dialogue, we have to be willing to make ourselves vulnerable, which as men, we often learn how not to do. We learn to pretend that we're being dialogue or open when we're not really.
We're keeping our cards close to our chest, yeah.
Absolutely.
So God, when he created us freely, he was taking that risk with us, yeah. And in the absolute sense, that is the possibility of dialogue. Yeah. A British theologian, I forgot his name now, once said to me that you can summarize the Bible in one word, nevertheless. And I always thought that was brilliant, because that sort of points this out, this risk that is constantly being taken and has to be taken again and again. Thanks very much for all of that. So I thought maybe we can put up the text and then look and have some comments and a discussion on various aspects of it. But I would like to invite maybe some comments already now to what we have heard, if people would like to say something.
Yes.
Federico, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I just think that apart from a couple of comments about the next session, and I think there is a very interesting and nice remark by Anastasia, who suggests to have our discussion about a feminist dialogue with Buber on the 8th of March, on the International Women's Day. And I think that it could be also something we can consider. It's a nice idea, I think. And then there are a couple of comments made by Peter, and particularly one which engages with what Vic just remarked now. So there is a bit a comment about the relationship or the dialogue with ourselves and the possibility of thinking about trust in an ethical way, and it brings up the notion of not the ethical notion of the disposition, I think, from Aristotle, if I understood it correctly. And on the same topic, the dialogue with ourselves, there is also a comment by Emily, who refers instead to the relationship with our mothers and to our childhood. I think maybe it's worth Peter, if you want to expand a bit what you've phrased there, because maybe it's the right point to do it.
Well, just so my comment in the chat, it did go back to a question I posed to Paul last week, and it's a matter of puzzling, and I think Vic was also sort of pointing in a similar direction, puzzling over this distinction between the ethical and the existential, or the notion that the idea of dialogue is not an ethical idea precisely. And it may just be that, so my field is political philosophy, and when we get outside the political part, there may just be some philosophical language that I'm less familiar with, and distinctions that are made that I'm not as well versed in. But the more I think about it, the more it just seems to me it's hard for me to understand how one would be the kind of person who would enter into these sorts of dialogues, be prepared to enter into dialogue, to encounter people in a spirit of dialogue without having developed certain virtues. Federico's right. I mean, I'm thinking back to the Aristotelian tradition of virtue ethics. Seems that it would call for a certain kind of disposition. And so it's hard for me to understand the sort of wedge being driven between thinking of this in ethical terms and in some other sort of terms. I guess for me, they seem to be closely connected. So that's where I was heading with the question. But I don't know if that's something to be taken up or in what direction.
I think there are two schools of thought emerging in our group. And the one is to say that this is ethical, and the other is to say that it's not ethical. And I've been a lifelong foe of ethics, but Vic has been a lifelong friend of ethics. And so this is a nice discussion to have. Now, Paul, is that something that you could comment on? Why you also made that distinction? What does it mean for you?
I think we can make a distinction between virtue and values. Values are from outside. We absorb them we gather them from our parents, our environment, our teachers, in the ordinary sense, our ministers, rabbis, imams. A virtue is an internal disposition, as you said. I think what Buber is really trying to develop in particular this area we're considering is the bridge, it's a dialectic, if you wish, between virtue and values. We do have certain ethical values that we adhere to, certainly when we think of in the universal sense that this is obligatory or has a categorical dimension, to speak in the language of Kant. In other words, normative. And virtue is an internal dimension. And I think character for Buber is focusing on virtue such that it can somehow give rise to an ethical life. So just to respond very quickly in shorthand to Peter, in a very well articulated question or issue, the distinction between values and virtue is crucial. And Buber, of course, assumes that we should be nice, we should be good, we should be caring. We should be attentive to others. That's where ultimately the concept of responsibility enters. And recall in the first part of the I and Thou, Buber has a brief disquisition or focus on the nature of love. Love has various expressions. It's mercurial. It's informed by passion, eros, and lust, etc. But if love is understood as responding to the other, what he calls the presence of the other, and that's another term we have to unpack, what he means, the presence of the other human being. That's dispositional. I make a quick I'm speaking because I don't want to dominate the discussion, but the very first lines of I and Thou, he uses a term what's translated as attitude, Haltung. Haltung can be where you hold yourself, where you poise yourself in the world. He doesn't use other terms, philosophical terms, attitude in a phenomenological sense or a cognitive sense. But it's the way you hold yourself in the world. And that does require risk because we are vulnerable. We can be hurt. Buber speaks quite often about mismeetings. You open yourself up and the other person's not prepared. Um, you can be hurt, and risk is crucial. It's just an academic, but I think helpful reference to the notion of risk. It goes back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, as we recall, that bourgeois society, what we call the modern liberal society, is really conformist. And it's a faulty understanding of individualism, which is really ultimately not true to one's individuality. We have to take risk to be thyself, as Nietzsche says in Zarathustra. That inspired many, what it means to be oneself, to have that risk. And Buber develops that in the way that I think Vic, if I may refer to each one by first names, I don't know if it's considered proper, but let's assume it is.
Yeah, we're on first names.
Said so well.
It's really interesting how, just to keep this going just for a moment, the notion of, in the first part of the Buber and now, the way that you hold yourself in the world is a bodied recognition. That is, holding myself is both a mental and a bodily framing. And I always think it's one of the strengths of the Hebraic tradition in its acknowledgement of the way of an interrelationship between the mind and the body. So it's already there, it's already revealed in Buber's framing of the way that we kind of hold ourselves in that way. But I just want to take on this thing about the difference between values
and virtues,
as the danger of being too strict in the kind of separation. And in response to what Peter was saying, in an Aristotelian tradition, the virtues become linked to notions of habits that are created over time. They're dispositions as habits that affect our capacity to relate in different ways through those virtues. Buber's framing is slightly different in that it isn't just through habit, but it does seem to me that there is a kind of form of ethics which certainly what I'm interested in and have always tried to work with, which goes across the balance between virtues and values, and also doesn't want to see the realm of the political as somehow completely separated from the realm of values. And also that one of the strengths of feminist work, so gender is really important in some of this, is the way in which the personal is taken to be political and how to understand that. So that the notion of the personal is also how I relate to myself. What kind of dialogue do I have with myself? What's the words with which I learn to speak to myself? And how do I learn to be in dialogue with others in a way which is real? And was it kind of Rilke who said, the hardest task that we have as human beings is how to love in our most intimate relationships. It's really difficult to sustain an openness and a love in our most intimate relationships, which are often the relationships that we take for granted. So even how it is that we create dialogues within our individual relationships in a Buber frame is very challenging, because it's the idea of how we curate or create those relationships anew every day. While most bourgeois tradition basically says, once you've fallen in love, gay or straight relationship doesn't matter, and the relationship has been established, then your task is to go out into the world and succeed or achieve. That's basically the framing of a kind of liberal moral culture in a way. And the idea that you need to work on your intimate relationship, whether it's straight or that it takes work to sustain a relationship. And the intimacy isn't simply something that's there and can be taken for granted as established when this relationship first started, but is something that has to be worked on almost daily, as does the work of creation. God's creation is a work of every hour and of every day, is a really challenging idea of the difficulty of how intimacy needs to be worked on. And it's a matter of how trust is something that also isn't something that can be taken for granted. So we talk about trust or distrust, but the notion of how trust has to be worked on and carried through and learnt about, and how is it that I'm still learning this process of how do I not escape into a kind of inner part of myself where I'm not really sharing what's going on for me.
Okay, thanks very much, Vic. I'm conscious of the fact that Emily's question was still hanging in the air, so I just wanted to check where we are with that, and then Artemis had a comment to make. Emily first.
You mean to say with ontology and phenomenology?
Was that the point? Yeah?
Yeah, because I feel, from my reading, that Buber is more of on the side of ontology, because he gives a lot of importance to the essence of the being. In other words, it's as if, we are born with the disposition of virtues, which are our qualities, and the relation that we develop to our first relation with our mother, because that's where speech starts, and that's the internalization of our exchange with our mother is the beginning of speech.
Yeah.
And so the internalization of speech is the dialogue that we have with ourselves, I think,
Yeah, I remember you said something like that also last time, and I think it's very important, because when we say phenomenology or ontology, we're almost already in a kind of abstracted way of thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the point you're trying to make is there is an embodied side to the emergence of speech in the actual physical relation of that we have with our mothers.
Yeah.
And that opens up this whole realistic sense of what the between is about, that somehow escapes maybe philosophy altogether. Or philosophy can elucidate it, but it's a lived reality. I think that's a very important perspective to keep in mind.
If I may just add to that quickly.
Yeah.
In the first part of I and Thou, Buber speaks about the inborn thou. That's actually even embryonic. The child experiences a oneness, a unity, a nurturance within the embryo. And if they just interpose Freud's term, once the child is born, slowly she encounters the reality principle, where you are alone. You've been separated from your mother, separated from the embryo and all its nurturance. And that's the you might call the primal trauma of entering the world.
And that's also, again, is a very Taoist idea that sort of in Taoism there's this idea that a human being is most alive as a baby, and we're trying to get back to that state rather than towards the end of life in a state of wisdom. Thanks very much for that contribution. Artemis, you had a comment as well.
Yes, hi. There is a very interesting intersection between many of the big words that float around before. So I find that from my experience in art, and certainly in better educational environments, there is this intersection where trust, love, intimacy, and this everyday renewal happens only happens if one actually lets go of themselves, but while maintaining this trust to oneself that by letting go, something beautiful will be created in between. So I think that this could somehow work within this framework. if we could articulate it as in trusting that one will not lose themselves if they trust the other and themselves and just let go of their individuality in a sense. I don't know if I'm using the correct terms. I'm not a philosopher. I don't. Yeah. So and also having in mind again that for me, both education and art are about truth seeking. So in order to approach the truth, one essentially for me needs to trust that the other will handle themselves with the other person with the respect, but essentially one has to let go of themselves in order for that to happen somewhere in between. And everyone actually has them to let go of themselves.
When you say let go of yourself, do you think of that as letting go of the ego when you take the risk?
I'm talking about looking beyond what one holds as sacred, intimate, important. So yes, in one sense, the ego, but with it sometimes the ideas as well. So when a group creates in the arts, we all have to be aware of the fact that to make something common, we need to leave our self-importance behind without thinking that we're not important contributors, to put it in very practical terms.
Yeah.
So yeah, in a sense, the ego, but on the other hand, the ideas as well, and one has to enter these relationships as a blank paper.
Yeah, no, that's like in a collective project.
In the process of creating something that looks towards the truth or God or education. And that is something that is new every time that this process starts again.
It's
itself has to be continuous.
Jesus also says you have to give up your life to gain it. I don't want to.
Did Jesus quote me?
I think he might have been proleptically aware of what you were going to say now.
Wonderful.
But I think that I think that this idea. I mean, this idea of that we have to be willing to give up what appears to be sacred to us in order to find genuine life. That seems to me also to be a Hasidic idea. And I'm thinking here of this wonderful story that we read several times of. Actually, I sent a link to Paul of a blog story of Rabbi Raphael and Yitzhak, where the rabbi is confronted with holiness in the form of that which is completely going against what he holds sacred. And he learns, but then in the end, he doesn't really learn, but it doesn't matter. He goes back to his holy city and everything's fine. So I think that is a very important notion. It also points to the difficulty of how we do this, and whether this can be that. Maybe that's whether that what you're talking about, can that be a matter of education of character? Is that something that we can educate for? What do you think about that?
Sorry, I think that because I think that only by what Vic said, this for an educator to do that, they have to lead the way and be ready to be vulnerable themselves and show that, show rather than say it or teach it. You have to enact it, you have to embody it, and then inspire someone to want to. With the vulnerability, obviously, you show that it hurts. Obviously, it hurts to open up the self and be.
There's the example in the Buber piece where he talks about educating about relationships with the Palestinians.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a minute, Vic.
That'd be a good moment to get to.
First, Katrina wants to make a comment, and then Jordan as well, and then we can go to Marcus, and then that leads into the Palestinian discussion. I'm trying to orchestrate things here. Yeah.
No, that's great.
Can you hear okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just following on from Vic's comments, and then the tension that's emerging in a way between this notion of working on ourselves and working on our relationships, and then letting go. They seem to be at odds with each other. And I think what's really striking me is that when we bring our sort of maybe vocabularies and mindset of 2020 to Buber, we get these really interesting dissonances. Likewise with risk. So when I'm thinking of risk taking now, then I can't help but think of things like the Risk Society, you know, the inflecting risk in a different way, not risk as this opening up of oneself to become vulnerable and thereby being able to have an encounter. But, you know, when Ulrich Beck wrote the Risk Society, it's after Chernobyl. It's the fact that now our modernity is so complex and so enmeshed in these huge risks, which are beyond our control to really manage. And so much of the infrastructure of our societies is dedicated to managing those risks and manufacturing them and then managing the fallout from them, you know, literally and figuratively. So that I think risk takes on a new inflection. And what I'm really struck by reading Buber now is the freshness of his language. Now, I know, Johan, you said that from a gender point of view, some of it needs to be updated. I still hold to the difference between the German and the English there. I suspect the German needs less updating than the translations do. But what I wanted to come in on was responding, Vic, primarily to your comments about working on the self and working on the relationships. That I'm wondering if that's framed that way, because when we go into the Du Welt with Buber, it's almost epiphanic. It's, as you said earlier, it befalls us. It's bestowed upon us, and that doesn't fit so easily into a model of working on the self, which could be co-opted indeed for a liberal model, neoliberal model of self-optimization. So as we sort of navigate this language, in a way, it keeps gifting to us. That's what I'm finding. It keeps kind of shoving us sideways out of an instrumentalized concept, which working on the self and working on relationships could too easily become, from my sensibility. So I just wanted to sort of bring some of those comments together and ask whether we need to think about risk in a different sense now in our current context, whether it's possible to recuperate the notion of risk for a project of vulnerability and encounter, or whether it, you know, we've gone too far into an ecological crisis to think of risk in that sort of way.
Yeah, that's a very wonderful contribution. Thanks very much. And I think this point about gifting, that this language maybe also in its strangeness always puts us outside of these habitual ways of thinking. That is one of the riches of it. I must say, when I started to use this word, I didn't like it for these same reasons. It seems to have been so much pulled into that direction of the calculable or unimaginable or uncalculable risk, that it's almost become a banking notion, that it's lost that sense of exposure that we were trying to capture with it. But you could maybe attempt a fundamental critique of Ulrich Beck by saying that he co-opts an in principle existential language to create a kind of sociology of that feels good in a terrible situation. But yeah, so that is no, I think absolutely we must take these things on board. So Jordan, you wanted to come in as well, and then Marcus.
Mm-hmm. I actually will pass the baton. I've become overwhelmed by the nice conversation, so I'll mute myself. But thank you.
Okay. And then so is it? What shall we do? Shall we go to the question of the Palestinian Jewish relationship? Or
there is maybe a small. Sorry, there is a short comment by Emily about the pandemic as a situation and the relationship between the pandemic and vulnerability. I don't know whether Emily wants to intervene on that before we move on.
Thank you.
I think that the pandemic has taught us that we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable, and then when we think about it, it's our whole relation to nature, and the fact that we have already. I'm going further than you, Catriona. You know, we've depleted the planet. Now we have to go to Mars I'm an astronomer, you know, we have to go there to look for sources of energy because there's nothing that we depleted it already, you know.
Is that really true?
Oh, yes, that is true. And we are depleting it every single day. Every time there is an extraction of petroleum and other minerals and, you know, fracking and all that, we are depleted. It's depleted already, and it's not going to come back. It's not going to come back. So with the pandemic, we understood that we have to respect the animal kingdom, because they have their own rules and their regulations. So it's a kingdom, you know, that we have to respect it, because that's where it came from, you know. And it shows our vulnerability and our interdependence. That, you know, if we don't put on the mask, if we don't respect social distancing, we are not going to get over this pandemic, you see. So we are interdependent, and this is where the comments of Vic come in, you know. We hate being interdependent because we are educated to be self-sufficient. So, you know, that's the cleavage. Yeah, the cleavage shows itself, and what, you know, we become self-aware that we are vulnerable and dependent on each other, and the split comes in immediately, you know. It's simultaneous, and we hate it, you see. So this is the split of the Western society, and how can we come back and I mean, how can we fill the split, you know? How can we make it whole, you know? It is by seeing the gap, first by being aware of it, you know, by being aware of it, and then finding remedies. For me, I think it's psychoanalysis, you know, psychoanalysis from grade 0, you know?
Yeah.
And, yeah, you know? Okay. So this is what I wanted to say.
So thanks very much for that contribution. And I think it links to the notion of, so where does character education begin, or where does it lead? And maybe the very practical question, what is the relation of psychoanalysis to what Buber here calls the education of character? Is there a place in that, or a necessary place in it for an engagement with the unconscious? That's a really open question. I don't know what to say about that, but I think that can imagine that there probably is.
But it depends on the teachers, you know. Buber gives the role to the teacher. It's up to the teacher to bring out the soul. This is why I think he's more ontological than phenomenological. The essence, you know, of the spirituality and of the integrity of the soul in the student. It's up to the teachers to do it, you know.
Yeah.
And the thing is, you know, Buber says it's not through knowledge, you know. That's the thing, you know. It is not through epistemological means. So he leaves knowledge to one side, but it's exactly through the dialogue between the teacher and the student.
Yeah, and in the text, I'm just putting it up now very quickly, because what you're saying brings back to mind a passage where he does talk about this on page 126 here at the bottom, where he talks about this moment of the teacher for the first time stepping into the classroom without that being part of his training or her training as teacher. And then we get this encounter, I think, Emily, that you are talking about. The teacher who is for the first time approached. Hang on, I've got the wrong passage. Where is it? And then we get to the Arab terror. Oh God, I can't find it now. Oh, here. For the first time, a young teacher enters a class independently, page 133. No longer sent by the training college to prove his efficiency. The class before him is like a mirror of mankind, so multiform, so full of contradictions, so inaccessible. I think this echoes very clearly what you were just saying. He feels, these boys, I have not sought them out, I have been put here and have to accept them as they are, but not as they now are in this moment. No, as they really are, as they can become. So as they really are is how they can become. It's again very, very Blochian. But how can I find out what is in them and what can I do to make it take shape? And the boys do not make things easy for him. They are noisy. They cause trouble. They stare at him with impudent curiosity. He is at once tempted to check this or that troublemaker, to issue orders, to make compulsory rules of decent behavior, to issue learning outcomes and lesson plans. This is even what we have to do these days at the higher education. Unbelievable. To say no to everything rising against him from beneath. He is at once tempted to start from beneath. And if one starts from beneath, one perhaps never rises above, but everything comes down. But then his eyes meet a face which strikes him. It is not a beautiful face, not particularly intelligent. It's like God talking to man, isn't it? But it is a real face, or rather the chaos preceding the cosmos of a real face. On it he reads a question, which is something different from a general curiosity. Who are you? Do you know something that concerns me? Do you bring me something? What do you bring? So I think that passage describes rather beautifully this becoming aware of the gap and becoming aware of what is needed in terms of relating to ourselves as whole and to the other as a whole person or a whole human being, and what that means for education. All these things that we've been talking about, because this does, as Vic and Paul said in the beginning, this does require work on yourself, in sort of maybe not in the Californian sense of the word, but in the sense of having had that engagement with yourself. Without having had that engagement with yourself, it is impossible to respond to that question that the pupil brings. And this idea that education starts with a question from the pupil. Well, pupil is, I don't know what you want to use, but I think that is a very important shift in our normal understanding of education, where it is the teacher who brings stuff to the student, who then has to open their mouth and it's poured in. It starts with so the teaching moment itself starts with a response, is a response to a question. Without that, it cannot happen. So this teacher must put themselves on the line, as it were, because without that, this question, who are you, cannot emerge or rise up on the face of the student.
And it's so difficult. If I could just jump in there, Johan, because that was the passage I was so moved by, because we cannot do that now. You cannot do that online. You need what Sloterdijk calls the interfacial sphere. And I think he's coming now, as I begin to realize more, perhaps from Buber than I'd known. And Levinas talks about this sphere as well, that's where the encounter happens, is between the faces. And if you're teaching on Zoom, you're not even looking them in the eyes. You can't.
No, that's right. And half the time they switched off their video cameras and you're just looking at these little gravestones, you know.
And it's really, I mean, the impacts of that are going to go on for much longer. Even after we have the vaccine, we've lost, even just thinking of this year's cohort of first-year students, you know, where is that? Who are you? He addresses this face, and it was the face that had given him the question and the possibility for the opening of the encounter. And it ends up being about this wonderful thing about, you went talked about the Dead Sea in a geography class, but it's much more than the content, as the designers of online instruction like to call it. They always talk about building content, but building content has very little to do with this encounter.
Precisely. In our university, they've now the academic enhancement team speaks of technologically enhanced learning when you're giving a class on Zoom, as if it's somehow better, you know, already in the language. It's very, very scary. I completely agree. And it's so hard to even find in your set. I notice it in myself, even to find a sense of legitimacy to say these things, or to have the feeling that you constantly have to prove it. You have to demonstrate it, or you have to make it put it in such a way that it cannot be denied. These things are very, very problematic.
Is there a way that given what's being said, that there's a different way of somehow acknowledging the situation, a very difficult situation that students are in right now. And even opening the question like, what does it feel for you right now? In a kind of Buber way, opens up a conversation which isn't necessarily part of the academic syllabus, but somehow allows an acknowledgement of how isolated and alone and desperate many of the students feel. Because they come into a class or a lesson when it's still almost a pretense that nothing's changed, everything has just moved online. So I wonder about this notion of what is it that people need to hear? What are the words now that students and teachers need to hear? I was very taken with the notion that was just brought up before about depletion. You know, when it was said the earth is depleting, I was wondering what it was, and this is a way of thinking Buber really, which is, what are the words that need to be spoken in this context, in this time, at this moment, which are not depleting, but are somehow nourishing? And whether there's a way of thinking about dialogue, real dialogue, as words that are nourishing. It's like food, you know, and then there's, it's like food for the soul that students need to hear, that acknowledge the conditional situation that they found themselves in through no fault of their own. And I think that how depleted people are by the conditions of the COVID, and then addressing COVID. And I'm just struck by what was said about the notion of depletion, which is often what we're doing. We're depleting ourselves by constantly working harder and harder, or making more and more efforts, but not knowing how to feed ourselves or nourish ourselves in the way that Buber, which is why he's so suggestive, despite the language.
Katrina raised a hand about this. Or did you not?
No, sorry, that's an old hand. I'll take it.
Sorry. Michael did, and then Jordan as well. Sorry. Yeah.
I have a very, given the depth of everything, I have a very modest contribution to make. I teach a studio, which is like a seminar, to 12 to 15 students. The first exercise of the semester involves them designing their Zoom presence. So we talk about their clothing, their lighting, the background behind them, everything which sounds like an exercise in vanity. But actually it has a very interesting effect, because it makes them conscious of their own presence, and it makes them conscious of being looked at. So as a result, I get to see quite handsome students in front of very interesting, backgrounds, well lit, with good sound and so forth. It becomes a short exercise in self-consciousness before we move to the content, obviously, of the seminar or the studio. But it's remained with them, and it's remained possible now to speak to each other more personally.
Yeah, that's great.
Throughout the rest of the semester. So a small thing, but it turns out to be quite big.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Right, I mean, it almost works because it's indirect. If you try to talk to them more directly, say about how they're feeling about COVID, they might find it very hard to say anything. But you've wonderful, almost technique of kind of allowing them to find presence, which is what Paul was saying, having to think about the notion of presence.
And I encourage them to show their dogs and cats and hold them while they're talking. If there's a strange sound, I'll actually say something. Hey, who's doing dishes out there? Or, is there a fire? I hear a siren. And I will not let them turn off their cameras either, so that they're fully present all the time. Or turn off their sound, so that there's an ambience in the Zoom room. We're a little bit fractured, but I've put all that on the table. to try to increase the feeling of co-presence.
Shows you how difficult that notion of presence really is, isn't it? That sometimes it has to be approached indirectly in order for people
Yes,
to make the move.
absolutely. And you have to make it the subject of art.
Yeah. And with almost without talking about presence themselves. So, you know, you've found a way of teaching which is wonderful because it brings them into presence and it brings them into a different awareness.
And it slightly problematizes Zoom itself, but by surrounding it instead of pushing it away and saying, we can't deal with this, you actually bring their creativity to the fore and their sense of presence, as you say.
It's interesting. I wrote a little piece of, maybe I share it with the group, also on these difficulties with Zoom. And I try to use the older people amongst you will remember this, Marshall McLuhan's media. And I said, you know, Zoom is a hot medium. You have to cool it down. So it pretends to be high involvement, but it actually is low involvement when you use all the functionality. And only by playing with it, much like you suggest now, you cool it down and you draw people into it.
You draw people in, exactly.
It's like you have to think about it as the retrieval of the call-in radio show. And then it works. Then, Jordan, you had your hand raised as well. What was that?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Michael, for what you were saying about presence and you as well, Vic. And I appreciated, Michael, what you said about creativity. And just to share with you all how I've interpreted this this theme in my own teaching, and I happen to be teaching, quote unquote, teaching conflict resolution to elementary school aged children, and on Zoom, which has been very interesting for me to try to do. But what I've tried to internalize, and certainly in light of the chapter we were reading, is instead of thinking of coming to the encounter with a predetermined agenda, I have tried very hard to really work with the students, with the children, on creating something together. And so that the idea of presence for me is synonymous with, I suppose, as what Artemis was saying earlier today, a certain letting go and opening up of space within. My objective in these encounters, to sum it up, has been to really not have a clearly defined goal at the start, except that which encourages me to work with each individual student on, for example, creating a certain art project that speaks generally to anything that comes to mind for them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks. Yes, Michael.
Another topic maybe that I think was Katrina wrote. In the American context, you actually have to be very careful how you strike up intimacy with students. And not in the obvious case of having affairs with your students and so forth, or crossing some kind of line. But the students themselves are not always desirous of the kind of encounter that Buber seems to be rather blissfully advocating. The formality of teaching, the distance between students and teacher, is something that's built into at least my institution. You may not inquire about their private lives. You may not make that the subject because it's ad hominem. You may not make distinctions that go anywhere near race and gender issues or economic background. The distancing is built into the law of my institution. And so to seek an encounter is a very, very delicate, it's like a dance of scorpions. You really have to be very, very careful about what you reveal about yourself and what you expect students to reveal about themselves. And they have very, very, very complicated lives, just as you do. And it's a delicate dance. And when I read Buber on this, you know, I see a picture of a very small one-on-one consultative sort of education, master apprentice kind of long-term education. And nothing like how I teach. And I teach small classes, by the way. It's not like I teach 300 kids. Maybe when they come to office hours, something else changes and you're able to go to some other place. But my institution is not designed for encounter at all.
Katrina, would you like to respond to that?
The thing that jumped to my mind immediately when you were saying that, Michael, is something that came up, I think, in our first or second session, which is that even with his closest friends, Buber was per se, or, you know, that because you mentioned formality, and I wondered,
yeah,
again, coming back to the I and thou.
Well, you do try, right? Do we not? I mean, none of us who read Buber can talk to our students quite the same way as just a professional teacher does. We all seek for that the spark that says, I hear you and I hope you hear me. But they're few and far between. And I actually don't find that Zoom gets in the way, but I'm just pointing out what a very delicate matter it is, and how easy it is to go too far.
Yeah. Peter, you want to come in on this?
Just quickly, although I think this ties back also to some of the questions we were asking about teaching in the current moment. The passage that Johan put on the screen, that Buber is describing this experience in the classroom, just thinking of Michael's comment, it's not actually just a one-on-one master-apprentice relationship. He imagines himself looking out over a classroom full of boys, and then he sees one face. So it appears that there's somebody in that room that he can reach and touch in a particular way. It's not clear that he's touching all of them in that way. And so I think that, I guess the way I read this is more that it's not that we should expect that every one of our relationships with our students will turn into a sort of blissful ich-du encounter, but rather that we need to have, and I'll push back towards my idea of dispositions a little bit here, we need to have a certain kind of openness toward that moment when it arises.
Right, so Buber talks about readiness, the readiness, in your lips and on your heart, right?
Yeah, that's right. And this is something that we might cultivate in a way. But what we cultivate is the readiness to perceive the moment where we might take a risk, and then you get this meeting of readiness and grace.
Is Buber saying in that moment? I'm agreeing with this thing that there might be the one child or the one face, but when the response to that one face is real in some way, then the whole class in some way responds to it. He's not saying, oh, you just pick up one person and that with that one person you can have that relationship. It's that if you do or can have it with that one person, there's something that shifts in the atmosphere of the whole class, and everybody is awakened to a possibility in that teaching situation that they might not have known.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting what people are saying about this is the uneasiness of the personal. You know, I reflected that I was teaching rabbinic students last year, and it was, and you would think that there were only about 4 people in the class, but they were very wary of being engaged personally. And I was thinking, my gosh, what does this mean about how things are? But I think you really have to be, it's very hard to know whether it's the culture and the institutional norms that we're obliged to work in that are taking over in some particular kind of way, or whether it's something that students themselves want to really protect their privacy. I don't know. I think it's a really important question to engage across the different kinds of institutions that we're working with. But I certainly think in a neoliberal culture, there's a way that the personal has become a difficult terrain or territory. And that has to do with a kind of broader cultural shift than certainly my generation in the 60s and 70s really knew.
Right.
Yeah, it seems to be a kind of reversal to a kind of misunderstood Puritanism or so. That
No, it's consumerism.
if you
It's
say that,
consumerism.
if you say that,
was
if that
Consumerism.
yeah, if you say
consumerism.
that for Plato, the education relation is an erotic relation. You can leave the building without collecting your last paycheck.
Right. Students are customers.
Yeah.
And, universities are the business.
Thanks, Peter. That for that. I want to go to the topic of the Palestinians, but before we do this, I wanted to just so two remarks I wanted to make on the basis of this discussion. Paul asked indeed at the beginning, and Vic, you repeated it. Now I have to think about presence, what we mean by that, and I did put it in my notes for today. This let's call it basic trust, or this unconditional trust, without which which is the ground of dialogue, which is a kind of trust that there will be a future or so, or that it is possible from this wholeness, this integral perspective on the person to envisage a future. It seems to me that is what presence is. Presence cannot be just a static co-presence in the room of two people or of two things or something like that, presence to each other. It is a dynamic notion. And I think it seems to me at the level of the philosophy, if we just put it systematically, there seems to me to be almost a coeval, a parallelism between trust as the ground of dialogue and presence as what dialogue starts from and what it achieves or raises into consciousness. And I think it came very clearly emerged at the end of the Buber-Rogers dialogue that we read, where you will remember that at the end Buber says about this relation between the person, and he says, I don't want to talk about the individual, but I want to talk about the person and the world, not being in the world, but being with the world. And this withness of the world, of the relation to the world, that is the presence. So when we make ourselves present to another person, or when we experience that opportunity of grace where we can be present with another person, that is what happens. He distinguishes it from sympathy. It's not I feel your pain, but it is I'm with you. I'm with your pain, and that means that I'm open to this future dimension that is activated in trust, and that becomes the basis of in which the spoken word can take place. So there can be no speech if there is no orientation on the future. And so in some strange sense, communication and futurity are intrinsically connected. That ontological, there was no future, there would be no point in even talking. I just wanted to highlight that point. And then I wanted to highlight another point, that in the text, which we now haven't really looked at in that much detail, there is this movement from character development, which we have now said there are quite a few reasons to think that has to do with virtue, or that we think about that as a kind of virtue. And Buber talks about it also in terms of not disposition here or attitude, but in terms of habit. He uses that word. It is, and then he links it to, not very explicitly, but links it to the idea that this is the body. We have our body. We are not our body, but we have it. We have a heart. We are not our heart, and still our hearts can be broken, which indicates a certain level of a relation of freedom towards that which we have. We can do so. I can't throw it away. I can't say, well, I'd rather not have it, or I can't. If I say, well, don't want to have my heart, then that's not possible. I'm stuck with it in a way, just as with my body. But the relation, I have a relation to it, and so I can also develop a relation of trust to it, or this whole sphere of dialogue can happen also with that element, and that's maybe what he has in mind when he then tries to say character relates to the integrity of the human being, to the wholeness of the human being. And then interestingly, towards the end of the text, he introduces the notion of value. Maybe, I don't know, maybe in a way, Paul, that wasn't exactly the way that you spoke earlier. I did think very strongly of Nietzsche as well, and I thought that there was almost a kind of Umwertung aller Werte that he is playing with at the end of that essay, where he's almost implying that everyone has their own values, and that if you take that seriously, then you will, passing through that, you will discover a sense of universality in sort of the human family. And I just wanted to point out that there is this implicit discourse of value towards the end of the essay. I don't know, Vic, do you want to comment something about that? Because we discussed it beforehand. Or not, it's fine if not.
No, I think I'm fine. I think I've spoken enough.
Yeah, okay. So let's leave that. Maybe we can come back to that some other time. Let's now, in the 20 minutes that we have left, maybe look a little bit at the concrete question of the Palestinian situation. And so it's in the text. We can look at the text, I'll look it up. But Marcus also had 2 questions about it much earlier on in the chat. So can I ask you maybe, Marcus, to speak to that?
Thanks. Before I start, I'd just like to thank Vic and Johan for choosing this piece, which is absolutely brilliant and makes so obvious the relevance of everything Buber is saying to today. That passage which you just read out is the one which I highlighted as being absolutely brilliant. But I mean, the other concepts which you put in this passage, the teacher can awaken in young people the courage to shoulder life again. This is so relevant to the kind of world which young people are living in today, with or without the pandemic. I didn't want to interrupt the discussion, which was brilliant, but the subject of how one can resolve some of the teaching problems of Zoom is exactly what we're trying to do with the structured democratic dialogue that I mentioned earlier, and is one of the proposals I have for a subject for further discussion, but let's lay that aside at the moment. One of the things which was mentioned in the article, Buber said that young people are beginning to feel that because of their absorption by the collective, something important and irreplaceable is lost to them. Personal responsibility for life and the world. Now that brings me to the reason I wanted to ask this question about why to Palestinian teachers is Buber pushing this very, very important and significant piece of work. Who is he really talking to? Is he talking to the Palestinian teachers as potential interlocutors in a dialogue between Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs? Is he talking to the Jewish Zionists in criticizing their education system, that it's not developing these kind of ideas in the youth? Is the collectivism against kibbutzim in some way, the education system in the kibbutzim? I just find this so amazing, and why was it presented first to a group of Palestinian teachers? Not that there's any reason not to do that, but why did had he some specific reason for going there?
I think that it's maybe slightly misleading, because he gave this is a speech from 1939 in which Palestine was the British Mandate area. So and it was a lecture that he gave in Tel Aviv. So I can imagine that it was only Jewish teachers that he was speaking to that were part of developing the education system. But I don't know. I mean, maybe others know more about it.
But somebody mentioned Palestinian teachers.
May I clarify the issue?
Please.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
It's 1939, August 1939, when the so-called Arab rebellion or uprising took place from 1936 to 39. There was a coordinated effort on the part of the indigenous Palestinian Muslim Christian community to protest the mandates, the British mandates, explicit or express commitment to creating within Palestine a Jewish homeland. Palestinians understood that to be at their expense. So there was a rebellion, and at times quite violent. And it concluded with the issuing of the so-called white paper from the mandatory government, limiting Jewish immigration as a way of compromising with the Palestinians. But that's just the background. What Buber was concerned with, and he just recently had arrived in Palestine after being more or less evicted by the National Socialists, where he had never obligation the besieged Jewish community or a beleaguered Jewish community as an educator. And here he found himself in Palestine, and he was called upon by Zionist teachers. And then they called themselves Palestinian, as was indicated. And Buber used the opportunity to express his misgivings, about the Zionist conception, or the regnant Zionist political conception of nation building, of a nationalist, of a national understanding, of resistance to the hostile world around them, and that in a particular moment in the late 30s was manifest in the Palestinian Arab opposition to the Zionist project. And that's just the context of these concerns. What is it? How should we educate ourselves in the process of rebuilding ourselves, the Jewish people, and rebuilding our sense of self? There's a song that captures the Zionist ethos. We've come to build the land in order to be rebuilt ourselves. The Zionist assumption is that the fawning, acculturation, assimilation, the self-degradation that characterized Jewish life as a minority has to be overcome. There's been, and I've written about myself, but then others have done it much better than I, comparing the notion of negritude by the rehabilitation of colonial peoples within absorbed and in the stereotypes, etc. But I won't elaborate on that. But the context is to Israeli educators to avoid what Buber refers to as collectivism, collective will, and that he associates with nationalism and ultimately, of course, any totalitarian way of thinking about a community. As opposed to that is the radical individualism that was referred to before. And so Buber is concerned about how we create, educate ourselves anew, ourselves, the Jewish people anew, to avoid what he understood the horror of nationalism, of egocentric collective egoism of nationalism. On the other hand, also of the self-abnegating individualism has taken over bourgeois life, and Jews entered into the modern world through the bourgeois tutelage. Somewhere in between. That's the context. And he introduces the notion of character. Character means each of us have a responsibility. I think Emily said it very nicely and important, and with her permission, I'll plagiarize her. We're interdependence. That's the ontological ground, that we're independent of one another. We're not alone, and we need the other. Going back to the notion of course, the inborn vow, the embryonic moment of our of entering the world, of being nourished. And I put it very well, Johan, too, I think, in summarizing the exchange with Rogers, and as a implicit critique of Heidegger. We're not only in the world, but we are fine, as you put it, with the other. That, I think, can be expanded upon, but that's crucial. And if you want to expand it to the Palestinian question, the Arab question, of course, that's crucial for Buber. It's not to see them as enemies, but people who we have to learn somehow to live with. It makes a very important context of distinction between living next to one another and living with one another, nebeneinander and miteinander. And if we don't learn how to live with the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs, there'll always be a situation of conflict, because we have to somehow learn to share this land with mutual dignity, mutual respect, and if you wish.
So if you push that to its very fundamental question of the presence of put it very crass language now, but I would put it, the presence of the Jews in Israel or in Palestine in the first isn't, to what extent is that, so to what extent is Zionism facilitated by colonialism, by the fact that the British were ruling at that time in Palestine?
I think I made a very oblique reference to it last time I spoke. Buber actually objected to the Balfour Declaration. He was amongst the minority. He just felt it was creating a pact with imperialism, and perhaps, to put it in more dramatic terms, with the devil. And certainly was perceived as such by the Palestinians. And that's the seed of a toxic relationship.
But isn't this the challenge between living next to and living with something which impacts our societies everywhere? It's not just a particular Israeli-Palestinian problem. I mean, the problem of race relations, immigration worldwide. This is what we're living through today. And the amazing thing is that Buber has really not infiltrated the education systems of very many countries, if any.
And true, indeed, it's true. It's sad.
It is true, and it is also some people have also commented on the fact that our philosophy was written at the time, of course, of the greatest genocide that we've experienced, the greatest reduction of human beings to it that we have experienced in history.
Certainly.
Yeah. So there is a question. The question why Buber has had less influence on how education has developed is maybe related to this point. And I think that brings us to in some sense, to the question of technology, or to the way society, the way instrumental reason occupies our societies today.
But in this, he's really also focusing on the dialogue with the student who's opening up questions that are difficult for the teacher to handle. That's why this is such an important passage, I think, because the notion of what's best for your group, or the way that he frames it in terms of isn't the group more important or the history more important, is something that the student's bringing up, and then the teacher in some way has to move away from whatever the lesson plan was to be able to meet the student around the kind of difficult concern of how you think this, and the teacher then has to be prepared to say what his or her position is in relationship to this. So isn't it that somehow the student is moving the teacher onto a ground that the teacher feels is risky ground, and challenging and testing the teacher, and the teacher has to somehow be prepared to go with, often being unsure of what that might mean, which is very different from the way that often, like in contemporary notions of character education in kind of the US and Britain, where character education is often framed to responsibility to the group, my sense of responsibility to particular groups that I'm a part of, and showing that responsibility. And Buber's trying to hold out that we're both responsible to the group, but we're also responsible individually for the decisions that we make. And he doesn't want to contrast, and that's why Paul's notion of either the creative individualism or radical individualism isn't set against the social, and often brought up within a kind of liberal moral culture, as often we tend to see them as opposed. Your society is framed as a collection of individuals, and Buber's trying to develop this notion of creative individuality, which is both personal and political in some way. It's both individual and it's social, and he's trying to show that the teacher in that responsibility can be moved into areas where the teacher feels uncertain what she or he might actually want to say or need to say, and the teacher's taking a certain risk of having to discover in that moment something that wasn't prepared in the lesson plan, but is alive in the particular communication or dialogue. So it's the notion of dialogue as risky, again, emphasizing Paul's thing about it's not negotiation. It moves both characters or people into a space that they feel insecure and unsure what the words are. which, you know, happens in our own, in this workshop. Often we don't know where we're going to go or who's going to say what, but it's part of responding to what feels alive in the conversation, in the moment, just now. And that's what presence, presumably. That's the link between dialogue and presence. We don't know how to, we can't just as a matter of will make ourselves present.
Yeah.
We make ourselves present through the risks that we take in what we say. And I take Caitlin's point completely, that the language of risk, because with the Risk Society and the Beck work, we think about risks as things to control. So there's an instrumental relationship to risk. And Buber is hoping for a notion of risk that disrupts that. And I was hoping in some way, when I talked about working on oneself, not to think about it in instrumental, performative ways. But I think that's really something important to think about. How can we regain or revivify language which a neoliberal culture has appropriated? There's always a constant struggle between the way in which the dominant culture appropriates language and then how can we recover or discover new ways of kind of thinking and acting.
So that it relates to the remark in the passage that we were discussing, where Buber says when there is a conflict, the way out of that conflict is not, as the neoliberal mentality would say, to negotiate your way out of it, but it is something quite different, which is related to, I think, what you're talking about. Buber says, I have already said that the test of the educator lies in conflict with his pupil. So again,
Yeah.
dialogue is not about some easy feel-good factors. Right? He has to face this conflict, and whatever turn it may take, he has to find a way through it into life, into a life, I must add, a life where confidence continues unshaken. More is even mysteriously strengthened. And for confidence, I guess we might read trust. But the example I've just given shows the extreme difficulty of this task, which seems at times to have reached an impassable frontier. This is no longer merely a conflict between two generations, but between a world which for several millennia has believed in truth superior to man, and an age which does not believe in it any longer, will not or cannot believe in it any longer. That has to do with the background to this. This is indeed the Arab uprising. It has to do with this passage earlier in the text, where he invokes this idea of an absolute value. Yeah? To deny the presence of universal values and norms of absolute validity, that is the conspicuous tendency of our age. This tendency is not, as is sometimes supposed, directed merely against the sanctioning of the norms by religion, but against their universal character and absolute validity, against their claim to be of a higher order than man and to govern the whole of mankind. In our age, values and norms are not permitted to be anything but expressions of the life of a group, which translates it into its own needs, into the language of objective claims, until at last the group itself, for example a nation, is raised to an absolute value, and moreover to the only value. Then this splitting up into groups so pervades the whole of life that it is no longer possible to re-establish a sphere of values common to mankind, and a commandment to mankind is no longer observed. As this tendency grows, the basis for the development of what Kirchensteiner means by moral character steadily diminishes. How, under these circumstances, can the task of education character be completed? And it seems to me that dialogue is here introduced implicitly as that which can take the place of this appeal to a universal value that would somehow be available as kind of coming from the outside, as Paul said there. And at the same time to avoid the trap of nationalism, which is a kind of absolute value at a lower level, at a herabgekommene prijs, at a discount. But it is precisely the difficulty of going through this dialogue that doesn't so much reaffirm universal values, but in itself becomes a kind of universal movement, although it can never be objectified or made into made into a value in that older sense of the word, and there is an individual dimension. Okay, so we are at 6 o'clock. Thanks everyone very much for the very rich discussion today around character and value and trust and everything that has to do with it. We have for next time, so I will send these lists, these topics and themes out. Have a little bit of a think yourself about areas that you would like to take forward into the next semester. We thought that we might, the last session, that we might already sort of look a little bit ahead at this Buber and at these Buber and themes that we're going to look at, and to make that transition sort of in an easy way. We thought we'd start with the Buber Heidegger relationship, because that links to questions of dialogue and language we've been talking about, and so we'll have I'll send out a little bit of reading. There is a lecture actually on YouTube that Paul gave on this topic, which I've already pointed you to, and there's also an article, a text that we will look up. But so that if everyone agrees that would be an interesting thing to do, then we would like to make that the topic of the final session before the holidays, and then also discuss hopefully next time a list of topics for the 6 sessions in the next semester. So I will be sending that out. Want to thank everybody for being here. I hope to see you all back in 2 weeks. Vic, any final words from you?
It's just been a wonderful session. It's just so lovely that we're all holding together. I didn't realize that we could hold together in these very tense times, and people are really returning. So I think it's great if we can find ways of just carrying on. I just think it's been a very rich discussion. And I think that one of the difficulties, just to acknowledge with Zoom, it's very hard to have conversations or dialogue. You know, it's like one person speaking.
Yes.
We can't talk to each other as easily as we could to follow up conversations in a room. So I miss that. I miss being able to say, let's just spend another 5 minutes and talk about this with a particular person who's raised something. And we're not going to be able to do that, but I think using other means or using emails or something else, we can hopefully carry on the conversation. So
I hope so too. And that's true. And that's why I said it's a bit like the radio show. So I'm your host and I'm saying goodnight to all of you. And Paul, thank you very much for being here with us. I hope that you will be able to join us next time as well. And wish you all a wonderful week ahead, and see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Johan. Thanks.